Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing something a little strange. Over the last couple weekends, I went to the Scioto Open in Columbus, Ohio, and I got 2 second places, one in Longsword and one in Saber. And the only reason I bring that up is because the person I lost to in both cases, and the person who won the gold medal in both Longsword and Saber, was also the exact same person, Brandon Zipplinger. And I wanted to watch the footage again of me losing to him twice and try to break down not only why I lost, which is normally what I would do, but also to try to point out some of the exchanges that happened in both Longsword and Saber that were similar and also different. I think a lot of times when I put things on this channel, I tend to focus on Longsword, and that's primarily because I think it has the highest level of competition and the most participants. But that being said, there's still nothing wrong with some of the other weapons, but I often find it difficult to find the time or the place to really bring it up. So I figured this would be a pretty good time. So we're going to watch some exchanges of Longsword and then watch a similar exchange in Saber and talk about why it worked in one and maybe not in the other, or why it worked in both, and just sort of break down how these two different weapon systems can be similar and how different tactics can work in one or both. So I should point out first thing that in all of these Saber exchanges you're going to see, I am not in fact left-handed. I actually just mirrored the video to keep it consistent where I would always be on the right side and Brandon would be on the left. However, if you're ever watching the Saber footage and you think it looks a little funny, that's why. So for this first exchange, we see a pretty classic scenario for both weapons. Both myself and my opponent come in with an entry attack and clash off of each other's strongs, bounce off, and throw an exiting cut that lands. The idea here being that in both of these weapons, you'll always have situations where both people attack simultaneously, but due to the nature of the attack, aka one that crosses the center line, instead of landing, both will simply clash, meet in the middle, and then both of your fists, your lead hands, will smash into one another and then go straight up in the air, at which point you have a choice either to continue to go forward and grapple, or back up and throw an exit cut. We both chose to throw an exit cut in both of these exchanges, and as you can see, there is a little bit of a similarity here in the kinds of mechanics that end up happening when two people clash together. Because your lead hand in both Longsword and Saber is the one that's doing the primary force and angle of your cuts, when they smash together like that, you can't really get a good exit until you have fully separated. However, with the Longsword, you do have another hand on the blade, which means that when you do separate, you can do things like Zverkaus by simply moving your left hand, or your non-dominant hand, into a different position, which naturally takes the right hand with it. So even though you don't really have to drive forward with that dominant hand, you can still get your blade into presence. As opposed to, of course, with the Saber, there is no other hand on the sword, and when you clash together, you really are completely stuck. There's not really much you can do out of that except separate, and in this case, throw something towards the hand. But in both cases, the hand is going to be the primary target. But the other reason I bring up this exchange is because it showcases that in a lot of ways, this entry attack is pretty much standard across any cutting weapon. You're going to see similar things to this in Longsword, Saber, and even Messer. And the idea here is that if you get used to understanding the principles of crossing the line and what kinds of things happen when two people try to cross the line at the same time, you're going to have those kinds of responses built into your brain for when you move on to different weapons. So for this second set of exchanges, what we're going to see is another instance where Brandon comes in with a strong first attack. However, in this instance, what is going to happen is I'm going to attempt to parry and repost off of that initial attack. But I get very different results for these different weapons. In Saber, Brandon is able to plow through my guard and then also stifle my counterattack, resulting in a clean 2 points for him. But in this Longsword exchange, I'm able to maintain my distance much better, back up a lot further, and as a result, get myself the parry repost that I wanted. And the question here becomes, why did this work so much better in Longsword than it did in Saber? And in my opinion, the answer comes down to two things. One, Saber is a lot faster, but also a lot smaller of a weapon. And I don't just mean small in the sense that it is a smaller blade. I also mean small in the sense that all of the movements, all of the attacks, all of the defenses are simply smaller. They require significantly less motion because they have significantly less target to protect because there's only one arm, one leg, and one side of the body sticking out forward. In a one-handed weapon system, certain parts of the body are significantly further back and thus non-viable as targets. For example, the backhand, especially with you like me, you put it behind your back entirely, and simply the left shoulder, the left leg, all of these things are so far out of measure that going for them is basically just a waste of time. But in Longsword, you have two hands on the weapon, and your shoulders need to be much more square. As a result, these parts of your body are much more likely to be hit. So, when someone is coming forward with a big, strong attack in saber, you often don't make as much of a movement backwards because you often don't need to. But as we see here, Brandon has done a very intelligent thing here, and that is when he comes forward with his attack in saber, he comes along the high line in such a level that if I simply throw out a weak or small parry, there's a good chance it's going to get blown through. Simultaneously, after he's done making this attack, our hands smash together, as we saw in the previous exchange, and that really actively prevents you from doing anything in the follow-up, resulting in a pretty effective offensive strategy. Come in high, come in strong, beat through a bind, and then maintain that bind afterwards in order to stop a follow-up. But this strategy, again, doesn't work quite the same in Longsword, because in Longsword, people are far more used to making big motions, and as a result, the weapon is a little bit slower, and the bigger motion you make on your defense is probably more likely to actually defend you. As a result, Brandon is not able to blow through my defense, though he does come very, very close, and because I have been maintaining my footwork backwards the whole time, and able to come back down over the top and get the score. So for this next set of exchanges, we have two thrusting exchanges, but one with, I think, the exact same set of objectives. In both of these thrusting exchanges, I am attempting to stab my opponent and not get hit back, which is obviously something that most people would want to do. However, I throw both of these thrusts in a completely different way, and I fail the objective of staying safe in completely different ways. On the saber exchange, what I'm attempting to do here is actually throw a very tricky thrust that I expect my opponent to try to parry. Because, as I said before, everything you do in saber is a lot smaller, by moving off that center line and throwing and using the curve of the saber to really loop around someone's expected parry, it's often common that they will try to parry you, only move a couple of inches, which is normally all they need to do in order to set you off to the side, and find that they haven't moved enough, get stabbed, and then try to hit you in the afterblow, in which case they're out of tempo. However, in the longsword exchange, I drive straight down the middle, expecting that occupying that center line is going to keep me safe from a cut, which it does not. And in my opinion, this comes from the exact same misconception that a lot of people have, that I'm also guilty of repeating every once in a while, which is that throwing a thrust straight down the center line is objectively the fastest way to land your thrust, but it is not the safest way to land your thrust. And in a lot of ways, there is a sliding scale of safety versus effectiveness, where moving offline can either make your thrust significantly safer or more likely to land, and that they're not always necessarily fighting one another. If we watch this exchange with the saber, what you see here is I use my short edge, I duck under, and I basically jab my opponent in the throat and attempt to basically duck their cut to my head, which I don't end up managing to do. But even assuming for a second that I had managed to just simply slip that cut, it still wouldn't have meant that I was safe. My thrust did absolutely nothing to defend me. But you might watch the longsword exchange and think, well, you occupied the center line, you were obviously trying to defend yourself with that thrust, and I would still say that the answer is no in that case. What I was really looking to do was land that thrust and then wind my blade up somewhere else, but I never actually did the winding portion, and as a result, I was leaving my entire upper body and lower body completely open to the cut that my opponent threw. So, if you want to keep your thrusts safe and you want to make it so that they end up in a bind that you actually theoretically can win, what you actually have to do is, rather than drive your thrust straight down the center line or wind it out to the outside in order to be tricky, you want to wind them towards the blade or towards the attack that you think your opponent is going to throw. This will leave the center line, very importantly, and it will shorten your range, and it will significantly increase the chance that your thrust gets parried. However, if you are going about this with that expectation, you can put your sword in a situation where you're okay with it being parried, because you might be able to force your opponent into a non-dominant bind, as they try to parry you. If they go so far up your sword that they land in your crossguard, well, you're probably going to stab them. But if they go all the way down to your tip, it means that they had to throw a cut that no longer threatens you. And as a result, if you simply let them take your blade, go weak in the bind, and then cut around to some other portion, you'll find that they often have to parry in a very, very awkward angle that isn't conducive to follow-up attacks, meaning that you've effectively accomplished the same goals that I was going for in the saber exchange, where I really wanted my opponent to parry me, but I wanted them to parry me offline and off-tempo, and they simply just didn't give it to me, partly because there was no reason for them to actually cross into that center line with their defense. So, to sum it up, if you really want to learn how to thrust for both of these weapons, you have to carefully consider the sliding scale between offensive capability, aka its ability to land, and defensive capability, your ability to protect yourself after it lands. So for our final two exchanges, we have one in which we see a high attack versus a low line attack. And the basic differences between these two really mirror each other across these two different weapons. There is inherent risk to going low no matter what, and that is because your arms are attached to your shoulders, and as I've said before, there is a geometric disadvantage to going to a low target, not only in terms of points, but just in terms of range. You have to get close in order to hit somebody in the leg. But there are still some aspects where going low in a longsword fight is very, very different from going low in a saber fight. As you can see from this saber exchange, I go low and my opponent just hits me straight in the head. And you can see pretty clearly from the instance that I do try to defend myself after I hit the leg, but there's just no shot that no matter how fast I am, I was ever going to be able to get my hand up to defend myself fast enough. However, in the longsword exchange, you see something a little bit different. You still see the same kind of countercut that my opponent tries to throw, but as a result of the specific kind of low line attack that I throw in longsword, I'm better able to defend myself. Now, in my opinion, the cut across the middle that my opponent throws does still kind of land somewhere. But what's really important about this exchange is that in the longsword exchange, I don't get hit in the head. And the reason I don't get hit in the head is from two primary reasons. One, the Zverkow is a very unique interaction for a two-handed weapon, and it's not something you can really adequately replicate in a one-handed weapon. And that is because when you throw a low-line cut, like I'm doing here in longsword, with a saber, your hand structure and stability is basically zero. If anybody touches your blade while you're throwing that kind of undercut, chances are they're going to plow right through you. But with a longsword, you have another hand on the sword, and you have a bit of structure that keeps your tip from going somewhere in the form of your non-dominant hand. And as a result, when I throw this low line cut, I land against the leg, and then I am able to very quickly post up and push my hands into a position where they are structured enough that the blade that is sitting there in presence can still defend me. If my opponent had tried to come down over the top, it is entirely possible they just would have landed right on my sword and I would have been perfectly fine. Contrast that with the exact same kind of move that I tried to do with the saber, only to find that it wasn't in position. This also has to do with the distance. Now, there's an irony here, which is that the longsword is the significantly longer weapon, and you would think that would mean that its advantage comes from its ability to hit a low line from a further distance away. And you'd be right if you were talking about one-handed strikes, but that is not what we're talking about here. In this particular instance, it is the length of the sword that allows me to get so close to my opponent when I throw my low line cut. And it's that closeness that also does a very good amount of work in keeping me safe in the afterblow. If you are so close to your opponent that they cannot adequately throw an afterblow at their full extension, they have to shorten their hands back down to their torso. But if you're throwing a cut to the head, shortening your hands all the way actually ruins your ability to cross your line. Think about trying to throw a cut like this. It's not going to be good, and it's not going to probably hit the right target. So, as a result, if you are throwing low line cuts with the longsword, there is a version where you just use the length to your advantage, throw it one-handed, throw a Geistling, and get it over with. But there's also the ability for you to get in very, very close and using the length of the blade, hit something really low while still keeping your hands high at an adequate place where they can defend you. As opposed to the saber, there's just no fundamental way that that would ever work. You might try to imagine how close I would have to get to cut somebody in the leg, but then keep my hand hanging up by my face. It just really wouldn't work out. As a result, Throwing low line attacks in Saber, in my opinion, is significantly more risky in every possible way. Not only, again, because you have to do it from further away, you have to do it with a significantly larger commitment so you can even reach the target, and most importantly, Saber is just a faster weapon, which means that your opponent's ability to read what you're doing and just hit you right back in the head is significantly increased, meaning that your no defense attack straight to the leg is probably going to get you killed in Saber, but there are some ways around it in Longsword that, if executed correctly, can get you that free shot. So that's going to be it for today. Obviously, this Thanksgiving is coming up on Thursday, so I'm not going to be having a video out then, but I'll maybe try to make a short or something like that. Other than that, if you want to see more stuff, I will be back next Tuesday.